The Mahabharata is a psychological chess game where every move is driven by flawed human logic. Watch these pieces fall. Every catastrophe in this story can be traced back to a single, specific choice. This was the world of Hastinapur. It was an empire defined by its stone architecture and rigid social hierarchy, a kingdom that functioned on the absolute certainty of its laws and the nobility of its bloodline. That certainty was shattered when Kinshantaning fell in love with a fisherwoman. Her father refused to bless the union unless his daughter's future children were guaranteed the throne, a move that would legally strip the rightful heir, Prince Devabrata, of his birthright. To resolve his father's crisis, Devabrata took the Bhishma vow. He swore off marriage and the throne forever, effectively severing the main trunk of the royal lineage. On this family tree, you can see the immediate result: chaotic, fractured branches sprouting to fill the gap. This solemn vow was intended to bring lasting peace, but it functioned as the first domino of ruin. By prioritizing an inflexible personal oath over political reality, Bhishma created a power vacuum that his family would spend the next century trying to fill. Three figures emerge on these unstable branches: Dhritarashtra, born blind and bypassed for the throne; Pandu, who took power but suffered from a frail constitution; and Vidura, barred from the crown due to his mother's social status. This instability poisoned the next generation, splitting the family into two rival factions: Pandu's 5 sons, the Pandavas, and Dhritarashtra's 100 heirs, the Kauravas. Within the Kaurava camp, the eldest son, Duryodhana, allowed his resentment of his cousins to fester. This envy was weaponized by his uncle, Shakuni, who systematically manipulated the boy's ego until the prospect of sharing power became unthinkable. When an empire is governed by unchecked human ego rather than stable succession, civil war is the inevitable result. The Kauravas moved from political rivalry to attempted murder, trying to burn the Pandavas alive in a palace made of wax. When that failed, they used legal maneuvers to force their cousins into a decade of exile. The escalation peaked at a rigged game of dice. Driven by a compulsive need to honor the rules of the challenge, the Pandava king, Yudhishthira, gambled away his wealth, his kingdom, and eventually the freedom of his own brothers. In a final, desperate move, Yudhishthira wagered their shared wife, Draupadi. He lost. The Kauravas responded by dragging the queen into the public assembly to be humiliated in front of the entire royal court. The tragedy of this moment is defined by the silence of the elders. Bhishma and Drona sat motionless, paralyzed by the technicalities of the wager, choosing to uphold the procedural rules of a game while a queen was assaulted in their presence. Draupadi responded by vowing to never bind her hair until it was washed in the blood of the men who touched her. With that oath, the political dispute transformed into a blood feud that no diplomat could resolve. By prioritizing the technicality of the law over the spirit of justice, the leaders of Hastinapur ensured the total moral collapse of their civilization. This bronze chariot monument captures the scale of the resolution. On the plains of Kurukshetra, the two factions finally faced one another, with millions of soldiers prepared for total annihilation. At the front lines, the Pandava hero Arjuna collapsed in grief. Seeing his own grandfather and his childhood teachers in the enemy ranks, he dropped his bow, unable to find a moral justification for the slaughter. His charioteer, Krishna, responded with the Bhagavad Gita, the text seen on this ancient Sanskrit manuscript. Krishna argued that when evil has entrenched itself within the institutions of a kingdom, inaction is not a virtue, it is a secondary crime. But as the fighting began, the Pandavas realized that their righteousness was a liability. The Kaurava commanders were virtually invincible when fought with traditional honor. To win, the Pandavas were forced into the shadows. They used a gender-swapped warrior as a human shield to disarm Bhishma, and used a misleading report about the death of an elephant to trick the master strategist Drona into a state of suicidal grief. They struck down the archer Karna while he was unarmed, and eventually won the war by landing an illegal blow to Duryodhana's thighs, violating the very codes of chivalry they claimed to defend. This is the uncomfortable core of the epic. Defeating institutionalized evil often requires the righteous to abandon their own moral purity. The victory was a devastation. In the final hours, the Kaurava survivors launched a midnight raid on the Pandava camp, murdering all of their children in their sleep. The survivors were left to rule a graveyard. The crown was finally theirs, but the triumph was hollow, weighed down by the trauma of the millions they had killed to obtain it. Decades later, the Pandavas abandoned the throne for these snowy peaks. This monochrome view of the Himalayas captures their final journey, a brutal ascent where each of them succumbed to the elements, one by one. At the very end, Yudhishthira was offered entry to heaven on one condition: he must abandon the stray dog that had followed him. He refused. For the king who had once sacrificed his brothers and his wife to the rules of a game, this final choice showed he had finally learned that his real duty was to the living creature beside him. The characters serve as cautionary templates. Bhishma's wife demonstrates that rigid vows can eventually force a good man to fight for a bad cause, while Karna's journey shows that blind loyalty to a friend can be a primary engine for destruction. Draupadi's story remains a permanent metric for a failing state. A culture that tolerates the public degradation of women has already forfeited its moral right to survive. Krishna's lesson is the most difficult to accept. True duty involves making agonizing choices in a world of gray. Wishing for peace while avoiding the conflict required to establish it is not enough. The Mahabharata claims that what is found here is found everywhere. It remains relevant today because the same conflict between our ego and our duty is fought inside the human mind every single day.